Good morning, folks. It's a beautiful April 5th morning here in Palmer, and yes, it is snowing. It's that time of year when we can see snowstorms that could bring anywhere from a dusting to maybe a foot. From into March to into the second week of April, we can see these kind of snowstorms. And I have seen it snow on Cinco de Mayo, May 5th. So today I want to do this video on this little locomotive that's on display here in downtown Palmer. I did a previous video a couple months ago, more or less about the condition of the locomotive and the damage it has sustained after a Bora event. Bora is a severe windstorm here in Alaska, and it blew the shed down and knocked the stack off and did all kinds of good damage. Looks like City of Palmer has come in, they cleaned it up, put the stack back on, and we'll see how long it sits out here without a shed roof. Alright, so this little video is about this locomotive. It is a Baldwin 040 saddle tank engine. It was built in July 1910 for the U.S. government. Yes, the U.S. government would buy trains to use for their purposes, usually military or maybe for military projects. This is more or less like a contractor's locomotive, ones that you would see usually by Porter, little locomotives that would go around big job sites ferrying supplies and material in and out of the job site. And once the job was done, they would lift up the track and move it. That's how the Alaska Railroad was built. They had what was called station men, these contractors, and they would work on a section of the railroad, whether it be from clearing to building the grade, all that good stuff. So there was a lot of locomotives similar to this that came to Alaska 100 years ago to be used in the construction of the Alaska Railroad. Some were used, I think most were used in Panama Canal construction and other sources. I think there was upwards of about 25. I know there is somewhere documented around 20 little saddle tank locomotives, but I've heard the number go up to almost 30. And most of these locomotives were never transferred to Alaska Railroad ownership after September 1923. And I know some were put in storage in Anchorage, and who knows where they all wound up. Some were sold off, some were scrapped, and some just plain disappeared. And this little locomotive is locomotive number 5, which it's painted on the side of the cab. And I'm gonna start walking around as I tell this little story here. There's a lot of traffic since we're right here on the main strip here in Palmer, so you'll have to excuse me. Excuse the noise, rather. So, this little locomotive came to Alaska. I'm not really sure when it would have come to Alaska, but I'm pretty sure it had to have been either the late 19-teens, maybe early 1920s. Now, there were two locomotives. There was number 5 and there was number 6. There's a picture of number 6 out on the ice at Nenana, going across the river there while they were building the Mears Memorial Bridge, or the Tanana River Bridge, as it was called then. Up north here of Palmer, there used to be a lot of large coal mines, various different coal mines, and narrow gauge track that was put in after the completion of the railroad. Now, the Matanuska branch is what it used to be called. The railroad track that runs through here in Palmer used to go all the way out to Chickaloon, and by the mid-1920s, early, actually probably more early 1920s. The coal mines out in Chicloon, excuse me, were shut down, and the line was rarely used. Um, Before Sutton, you have Moose Creek, and in the Moose Creek area, there used to be a bunch of smaller coal mines, and one of them was Premier, and the other was Buffalo. A lot of people mispronounce it, but it's actually pronounced Buffalo. But if you've been around here for a long time, it's Buffalo. So this little locomotive, along with a lot of other narrow gauge equipment after the completion of the railroad, went out to those mines to be used on the narrow gauge trackage there. Most of those pieces of equipment, the locomotives and little sidecars, had Lincoln pin style couplers. They didn't have the regular couplers that you would think of today. And the railroad, Alaska Railroad, did not want to spend the money to convert it to coupler. You got to remember, in the early days of the Alaska Railroad, very early days, there was narrow gauge Alaska Railroad trackage, the Chattanooga branch mainly. So the smaller pieces of narrow gauge equipment was transferred and sold to various mine operators north of Palmer, Buffalo Mine, and Moose Creek. There was a narrow gauge line that went from Premier along Moose Creek down to the standard gauge trackage at the base of Moose Creek Hill if you're driving towards Sutton. That big hill as you go down on the Glen Highway, just over that hill down the side, there used to be a large coal loading facility, narrow gauge tracks along the hill, and a couple of standard gauge tracks. The so the loading tipple is still there, so to speak. It's rotten and collapsed, but remnants are still there. Narrow gauge rail is still hanging in the air alongside the hill. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you wouldn't know that there's railroad grade and track and what have you buried in the muck. So I think it's about 1925 that number 5 went out there and worked the mines hauling coal for a long time. There's actually pictures of it. You can find them on Alaska Digital Archives of this little locomotive working Premier Mine and the narrow gauge trackage. So the narrow gauge coal trains would come down from the mines to a coal loading facility, and it would drop it off, and the coal would drop into standard gauge cars. Some years later, the narrow gauge was converted to standard gauge, and the Moose Creek branch was about 4 miles, roughly 3.5 something miles long, and the narrow gauge was disused. So number 5 was still used for several more years after that on the narrow gauge sections up in the mines. It's unsure when it was retired, I guess you can say. I know it just sat there in the woods for a long time. In the mid-1950s, there were some Palmer locals that came along and decided that this locomotive needed to be brought into town and put on display. And it was kind of a large operation from the stories that I've read and what I was told. And they put this little locomotive on display here. There's a couple of really old photos of it sitting here, probably more of in the 1960s, maybe early 70s. And it seems like it was in a slightly different location other than right here. So maybe if someone from a valley that's been around for a long time, maybe they can confirm that or deny that. I have seen pictures of this little locomotive sitting here, and there are coal trains, or coal cars, I could say. Must have been a coal train passing by when someone decided to take this photo. Of course, the coal mines are no longer open, and the standard gauge track here right behind me only goes a short distance and then it ends. There hasn't been a train downtown Palmer in about 12, 13 years now. Might change, maybe with 557. I don't know. Maybe they'll use track, maybe they won't. So there was another locomotive that was present along with number 5 up in the coal hills, coal mines. Um, Supposedly that disappeared with some various floods. If you know the region, you know that when the rain comes and it pours and it floods, it can wipe out the highway bridge and what have you. Um, but this one has made it out. It's been sitting here for many, many years. For as long as I can remember, it had a shed roof over it. So it's interesting to see it here all these years without the shed roof. Now, of course, it sat here for also many years without a shed roof. So, but I've never seen it without it. Kind of interesting. Um, it's a very unique perspective right now that will probably change. So I wanted to do this little video. It kind of ran longer than I wanted, but kind of give you a story and a history on this little locomotive for those that are interested. Well, I hope you have a great day. And for those that are enjoying spring and summer where you are, consider yourself lucky. We haven't hit mosquito season yet. All right, y'all have a great day.